This is arguably the best tight end class in NFL history and one that can reshape the NFL landscape as we know it. Who are the difference makers that you need to know about? Jeff Bell and I are going to discuss that today on a new episode of the Football Guys Dynasty Football Show. Jeff, you and I compared all of our rankings and kind of made a mini consensus between the two of us. There's a lot of differentiation between my rankings and your rankings, but there was one spot where you and I were in agreement. Tyler Warren atop the list. Tell me what makes Tyler Warren out of Penn State such a good football player.
First, breaking down tight ends, you got to look at them as inline tight ends and move tight ends, those wide receivers, those guys that can move around. And Tyler Warren profiles more as that inline type tight end of a Rob Gronkowski type mold. But at the same time, he can see the wide tight end, the move tight end usage. And that's where he kind of differentiates himself and separates himself. They used him out of the Wildcat. There was a crazy play where he snapped the ball, ran downfield, and caught a long touchdown against USC. Just all kinds of different creative ways to get the ball in his hands. And so that's what you're looking at with Warren. You're seeing a guy that has the size, that has the ability to be that inline tight end that teams are always looking for, but also the ability to flex out through formation and really kind of step into he's nowhere near the athlete or the receiver that Brock Bowers is, but almost an oversized type Brock Bowers role.
Yeah, I mean, he can really do everything. I feel like when I look at these guys that are kind of best in their position, my natural inclination is to try to find their weaknesses just so I can see, potential where maybe things don't work out for him. Couldn't really find a weakness in Tyler Warren's game. I mean, this guy's 6'5", 260. He's athletic. He's punishing. He's got really good hands. You can tell he's a former quarterback. He's a really just easy mover. He knows where to be as well, whether it's, finding that little soft spot in zone. He knows how to beat guys with his release off the line. I mean, I really like Lance Zierlein made the comp to Jeremy Shockey, and that is a really good comp. He plays a lot like Jeremy Shockey. He's got that tenacity. He's got the size. He's got the athleticism. I don't know what else there really is to say about Tyler Warren. I think that he probably goes, where would you expect, Jeff? Top 10, top 15, maybe inside the top 20? Where do you expect to see him get drafted?
I think he's going to go top 10. My expectation, I think you've got the Jets at 7 is going to be a potential landing spot. The Panthers, I believe the Panthers are at 9. They're at 8, I think. That I think is a landing spot potentially for them. The Colts at 14, I think is the landing spot, kind of in that range. So kind of between the Jets pick and the Colts pick is where my expectation for Tyler Warren lands. I think if you're going to find warts, he is a fifth-year player. He kind of didn't have a lot of production until towards the end of his college career. And again, it's kind of that landing spot grenade that where is he going to end up? Is he going to end up in an offense that can really feature that tight end with a quarterback that's able to get him the ball?
Now, we talk about landing spot, but let's just flash back to last year, Brock Bowers. When we saw the landing spot, we said, they don't have a quarterback, and Devontae Adams is there, and Jacoby Myers is there, and Michael Mayer is there, and we got really nervous. It didn't matter. And I think that Tyler Warren is one of those players who could be good enough to overcome a less than ideal landing spot. So really fun player, not a lot of warts in his game. And you actually, Jeff, again, we kind of compared our rankings here and made tiers based off of how these averages work. Let's go into tier 2. And in tier 2, we have Colson Loveland, Terrence Ferguson, and Mason Taylor. Now, I have Terrence Ferguson as my tight end 2, with Colson Loveland directly beneath him at tight end 3. You, however, have Colson Loveland at tight end 2. And before the show, when we were talking, you said that you actually kind of see Loveland in the same tier as Tyler Warren, who we just talked about. So tell me, I already asked you what you like so much about Tyler Warren. What is it about Colson Loveland out of Michigan that you think makes him just as good or in a similar tier to Tyler Warren?
So we said Tyler Warren is kind of in that Rob Gronkowski mold, that big kind of be able to play inline, able to carry the seam, able to work upfield, those types of things. Colson Loveland is more the Travis Kelce mold. And I think that those are, if you really think about it, those are kind of the two archetypes between the Rob Gronkowski and the Travis Kelce that can be involved in the short passing game. That is that flex tight end that can be a heavy volume guy. That's where Loveland profiles. And I think that I dropped my initial ranks. I had Loveland 5 in my first rankings, and that was over a month ago. And since then, I said at the time, it's a very, very narrow tier for me with him landing there relative to some of these other players. now I've just heard enough between. I think he's going to go top 20. It sounds like
Yeah,
Denver might be the floor for him. It sounds like Denver's borderline in love with him. So that's going to put pressure on. We talk about these landing spots for Tyler Warren. That's going to be some of these teams are going to be looking at Colson Loveland too. And you might have maybe the Colts might be an interesting landing spot. I know that they're a little bit iffy at that quarterback position, but that could be a potential
Sam
opportunity
Darnold
to walk
rumors
right
coming out
in.
of Combine Week. I don't know if you heard that.
Oh,
Sam Darnold in Indy could be some fun.
yeah, well, I mean, that could work well for Loveland, but I do think that you're kind of looking at that range between maybe the Colts pick at 14, Denver's pick at 20. I don't know that he falls too far beyond that. And then if he doesn't go to Denver, you've got the Chargers sitting at 22 with his high school or with his college coach, Jim Harbaugh, and a wide open tight end room for Justin Herbert. So I think there's great landing spots for Loveland. I think he is the number 2 tight end in this class.
And we do get that a lot with tight ends because they're not the same premium position that a wide receiver would be that gets drafted higher. So a lot of times we do see these really, really good tight ends fall into the end of the first round to good teams with good quarterbacks that are picking late in round one. And speaking of that, I think that we have a few other guys that might go in round one as well. Terrence Ferguson is my tight end too, a guy who really showed out and looked good at the combine. You know, I saw the athleticism on the field when I was watching him at Oregon and was really happy to see that he just kind of cleaned up, had the best 40 time of the entire bunch. Every single drill he partook in, he looked good. Very polished athlete who had the production in college to back it up as well. Jeff, when it comes to Terrence Ferguson, do you think he is a guy who's also going to be potentially going in round one? Or do you think that it's kind of Warren and Loveland going in round one, and then we might see some of these other guys trickle into day two?
My expectation, I think Ferguson's a day 2 player. I would be a little bit surprised to see him in day 1. I've got Mason Taylor above him. I think Mason Taylor is that player that you're kind of looking at the back end of round 1. I think he didn't test, obviously, but when you watch the tight end drills, watch them run the routes, it's one that it's fun when you can see them stack up and go one player to the next, because you occasionally will get a
Yeah,
guy. And to me, like Mason Taylor, when he ran through relative to couple of the other guys, kind of like, okay,
look
yeah,
different.
there he is. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I mean, Jason Taylor's son, obviously. So those NFL bloodlines. So that's my expectation as that player that you're kind of looking at. Like, well, we saw Washington add Deebo Samuel, add talent there. You see Washington, you see Kansas City, you see maybe the Eagles, kind of that range in the back end of round 1, potentially looking at that type of a tight end.
Now, again, I say that, you know, when I'm looking at these guys, I'm trying to look for some warts in their game. And I think the biggest wart in Ferguson's game is that he isn't a very good blocker. So, I mean, if he does get drafted, it's going to be purely as a receiver, you know, a la Travis Kelsey type of archetype, as you like to talk about. I don't think he's going to be lining up a ton in line. He's not going to be putting his hand in the dirt. He's not going to be blocking. But what he does as a receiver is what gets me so excited. You know, over 2 yards per route run. And what really jumped out to me is that he averaged 9 yards after the catch per reception. I mean, this guy, when he gets the ball in his hand, he's always looking upfield, always looking to make a play. And I like that about him. But we're still working our way down this list here. We're at our consensus tight end 4. I have him as tight end 4. You have him as tight end 3. And we're still talking about a guy who's a great prospect. You talked about his gauntlet drill, Mason Taylor. I mean, every single foot that he had was just right on the white line, just sucking those balls in like a vacuum. His hands look great as well. He is a very polished athlete, and he's huge. I mean, you look at this guy, he should not be moving the way that he does. But Mason Taylor is a guy who is just seemingly working his way up draft boards right now out of LSU. Like you said, you know, he's Jason Taylor's son. And who is it? He's also the nephew of Zach Martin, I believe, Jeff. I don't know. I forget.
Zach Thomas.
Zach
And
Thomas.
wasn't it
That's
Zach?
right.
Yeah, I
Maybe.
thought
Zach
Zach
Martin or
Thomas
Zach
was.
Thomas. He's got a dad and an uncle who are both NFL
No, it
players.
was
I
the
mean,
two
this guy,
Miami guys. Like, because Zach Thomas was the linebacker and Taylor was the defensive end, and I think like Thomas like married like Taylor's sister or something like that, if I remember
that
right.
sounds right. I don't know the inner workings of the Taylor family, but that definitely sounds right. And either way, Mason Taylor came out of there and he has looked great. And still, Jeff, just 20 years old. So there's a lot of room for growth here. He's getting drafted young and he is going to be able to develop. This is the last one we have in our kind of tier 2 here. I know you think that Terrence Ferguson might fall to day 2. Maybe Mason Taylor falls to day 2. It wouldn't surprise me if all 4 of these guys, Tyler Warren, Colson Loveland, Terrence Ferguson, and Mason Taylor, are all off the board in round 1. Talk to me about Mason Taylor, because I know he's a guy that you have really warmed up to, and you've got him as your tight end 3 right now.
Yeah, so it was Jason Taylor ended up marrying Zach Thomas's sister, is how that worked. So
Gotcha. All
just
right.
a clarifying point for the YouTube comments. Confidently incorrect, Jeff Bell. So, no, it's I do feel bad because I used all of Terrence Ferguson's time to talk about Mason Taylor, but no, I think Mason Taylor is, again, NFL bloodlines, a polished receiver. We've seen him step up in big situations. If you flash back, if you're a college football fan, a couple of years ago, there was a very, very close game with Jaden Daniels at quarterback in LSU. Mason Taylor caught the game-winning touchdown to beat Alabama in that game. So kind of one of those things of these, one of the things that I love in a prospect is when they pop in moments like that and you start to stack them up and you're like, oh, he just ends up being in the biggest moment and making the right play in the biggest moment. Those guys tend to work out in the NFL a little bit. I think Taylor's kind of got that. You look at the whole package, bloodline, you look at
Yep.
athleticism, you look at coming out of a blue chip school, coming out of LSU. I mean, that experience playing with Jaden Daniels already. You talk about players kind of landing in the back end of round one. He was Washington's tight end. I mean, they did take Ben Sennett, but
Yeah.
he'll reunite with his college quarterback there, Jaden Daniels.
Would be a lot of fun. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on where he goes, because if he does fall to the end of round one, like we kind of talked about earlier, there's some really good landing spots there. Now let's move on to tier 3. And again, we're still talking about really good tight ends here. We've been hearing it for the longest time. This is a good draft for running backs and a good draft for tight ends. And I think all this combine week did was corroborate that stance. We had the running back show out and we have the tight end show out as well. First guy I want to talk about here, I've got him as my tight end 6. You've got him as your tight end 4. So we both like this guy quite a bit. Elijah Arroyo out of Miami. He was kind of the number 2 option there, playing alongside Cam Ward. Xavier Restrepo was getting the majority of the targets, but Arroyo looked really good when he was given the opportunity as well. We really saw the big breakout last year after a very quiet 2021, 2022, 2023, but came on in a huge way last year. Really good hands. We saw him just consistently going up the seam and ripping off big plays. You, again, are a little bit warmer on Arroyo than I am, but that doesn't mean that I dislike Arroyo by any means. But what is it for Arroyo that makes him your tight end 4?
You talk about working up the seam, and he dealt with some injuries for a good portion of his Miami career. That held him back. Just the explosive big play player. And you talk about Restrepo, and you look at like Jacoby George, some of these other players out of Miami and that Cam Ward offense. It was really kind of inverted because it was Arroyo working deep in the middle of the field that allowed those receivers to work underneath. And a lot of times what you'll see is you think about that Travis Kelce, it's usually Kelce is working underneath of a guy like Tyreek Hill or some of the Xavier Worthy now or some of these other players. It was inverted. You flip it. You have the tight end as the guy that is the ability that has stretched the field vertically to allow those wide receivers to come in underneath. And that's what Arroyo gives you. And so to have a player that can win downfield, he profiles more as a classic inline tight end, but does have the athleticism that you can break him off the line, move him through formation. So those are all the things. He was a big Senior Bowl standout. He didn't really test at the combine. I believe he's dealing with an injury. So that we didn't see that level of testing, but I do know out of the Senior Bowl, he was drawing rave reviews because of his performance there. That's kind of where you're looking at an athletic package of a receiver that can win downfield. And as you can win downfield, you can become a red zone threat as well. And I think Arroyo is the type of player that will get it more on touchdowns than he will be a higher volume player, but he does have that athleticism. He lands in the right offense. He can be that touchdown guy.
And you talk about it, he is more of a traditional inline tight end, but they were able to move him around. You'd think that with Xavier Restrepo there, who played almost primarily out of the slot, there wouldn't be a lot of opportunities for Arroyo to play out of the slot. He logged over 50% of his snaps out of the slot last year. So he's already been able to do that, to line up as a wide receiver and to beat guys in man coverage. And that skill should translate well to the NFL. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about in this tier is maybe a bit of surprise, Jeff. I'm not really plugged into the Dynasty streets. I don't know what consensus rankings are, but when you look at what Harold Fannin did last year at Bowling Green, I mean, just he was atop every single statistical measure possible, targets, receptions, yards, touchdowns. He was a big play machine last year, but we know that he wasn't playing against the best competition either, being at Bowling Green. And a lot of people were hoping that he'd be this guy who would just really kind of take over. I know we've talked about the Jonnu Smith comps in the past, the Brock Bowers, maybe a guy who can get used all over formation, a guy who's going to win with athleticism. But he came out, and to put it blunt, Jeff, he had a very bad weekend at the combine. So we don't want to overreact too much and say, well, Harold Fannon's off our draft boards now, but a lot of people were looking at him in maybe that first or second tier, and we have bumped him down a little bit based on the combine. I think there's more of an important lesson here rather than talking strictly about Harold Fannin. Jeff, I know you and I have talked off air about this, but there is a strong correlation between athleticism for tight ends and production. And I think George Kittle was the last kind of guy who was an uber athlete that fell outside of the first 2 rounds. And since then, we see these guys who are really good athletes get pushed up draft boards. Harold Fannin now doesn't have that athletic analytical profile that we want to see, but he does have the college production and he does have the college film as well. So what do we do with a guy like this? A guy who looked like the most athletic guy in the field almost every game that he played, but then alongside his peers in Indy, all of a sudden doesn't really measure up the same. What are we supposed to do with Harold Fannin now?
Well, it's difficult because the Senior Bowl, he did look like the most athletic tight end. If you watch the Senior Bowl practices, the routes that they were running there, he was cooking, and so he was really beating guys. It was funny because I know vividly. I remember watching one of the tight end drills, and it was just got to be Harold Fannin's turn, and he just spun the defender around, and Daniel Jeremiah was basically like giving in-depth analysis on everybody else coming through, and with Harold Fannin, he was like, yeah, Harold's just cooking guys. It was like basically what he said about them. So it's like you've got that, and the production at Bowling Green. I don't The combine was disappointing, and one of our last episodes that we did, the expectations were very high for Harold Fannin to come in and be a big performer in the combine, because of some of that is that advanced testing, the zebra technology that they're running at the Senior Bowl, those types of things that said that he was a very, very good athlete at the Senior Bowl. His size plays into it as well. We talk about relative athletic score, and size plays into that. And so he's coming in on the smaller side. He's I believe a 6'3", 240-ish, 239-ish. And so with that size, you're thinking that it's got to be a 5'5", 4'5" guy. He's a 4'7" guy. So that really knocks you down, but he's a 7.57 on relative athletic score, which as long as you're above 5, you're still
puts him
kind
near,
of there.
yeah, he's
5 is
75th
like
percentile.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's
Yeah,
still
and so that's
75th percentile all-time tight end athlete. I mean, we're sitting here talking about it, it's terrible, and I think maybe just our expectations were so high that he
yes,
didn't come out
yes.
and run the fastest 40 and smash every single drill. Comes in, weighs a little bit less than we expect, a little bit shorter than we expect, doesn't live up to the lofty numbers. So that's why I think there's such an interesting discussion here, because we want to react, but we don't want to overreact. And I almost feel like, I mean, Harold Fannin was my tight end 2 in this class, and I have bumped him down quite a bit because of the combine performance. And I can't help but feel like maybe I am overreacting a little bit by knocking him from tight end 2 down to tight end 5.
Well, and that's where the value in tiers lies. And that's where
Right.
I'm looking at everything in tiers. And if I'm tiering Terrence Ferguson and Mason Taylor and Elijah Arroyo and Harold Fannin together after that performance, then Harold Fannin could potentially go from the front of that tier to the back of that tier. And so
Yep.
people get so hung up on moving Harold Fannin from your tight end 2 to your tight end 5. That margin from your tight end 2 to tight end 5 could be ultra narrow. And that,
Especially with how top heavy this class is.
yes, and so this draft process, you're putting together the picture and you're putting together the pieces, and some of it's, we have the beginning piece of what they did in college. Coming out of that, the Senior Bowl adds a layer to that piece. It adds another piece into that picture. The combine is another piece into that picture. Then landing spot, the draft capital, where they're going to play, and then you end up with the complete picture, and then that helps you solidify your ranks. So your rank should be fluid as you go through the process, because you're laying, just think about it as like, I think in my mind of like those like cellophane, like comic book strips where you like peel one off and there's a different picture or whatnot, and you
Yeah.
add everything
Yep.
together and it's the whole scene. But until you have that, you kind of have half the scene and you don't know what's going to happen in that scene. And so that's where I'm pretty fluid in my ranks. I try very, very hard to build tiers that I don't like to move them between the tiers, because I feel good about those tiers, trying to predict, really. I mean, what we're trying to do right now is predict that draft capital. But as you're dealing within those tiers, players can move up and down off of the slightest bit of news, of
Yeah.
rumors, of expectations, those types of things. And right now, it's just not positive momentum for Harold Fannin.
And I know we're doing our tight end show right now, but I just wrote an article Sunday morning about running back rankings and how those have been adjusted from the combine. And I talk exactly about that. And, you want to move these guys up and down within tiers, but I don't think that a combine performance alone is enough to move a guy up 2 or 3 tiers or down 2 or 3 tiers. And kind of what I talk about is, I compare Caleb Johnson to Taj Brooks and what they did in Indy this week. And I talk through all of the results and the size adjusted speed and the agility composite scores and all this. And I say, so now we'd move Taj Brooks ahead of Caleb Johnson, right? Of course not. No, because Caleb Johnson is younger and he has a better production profile and a better breakout age and all these things. What we do is we can move Taj Brooks ahead of the Woody Markses and the Kyle Manungais and the other guys who underperform, but we're not moving him way up the ranks. And similarly, where we might move Caleb Johnson down a little bit, we're going to move him down 2 or 3 spots and still within the same tier he was already in. And we want to do the same thing with tight ends here. Now, sticking with tight ends, we're going to move on to our tight end 7 now, still in tier 3. And this is a guy that I've been really excited about out of Iowa, Luke Lachey. He has been injured pretty much his entire college career. It looked like he was coming out to a hot start in 2023, was injured in his 3rd game of the season-ending injury, and never really looked like himself in 2024 as he was recovering from that injury. But he came out and surprised a lot of people with his athletic testing at the combine this week. So I had him as my tight end 7 pre-combine. Kind of tough to move him up from there. But Jeff, I see that you've moved him up a little bit to tight end 8. So he's a really tough player to evaluate because he did deal with so many injuries and never looked like himself in 2024. But talk to me a little bit about the ceiling outcome for a guy like Luke Lachey.
Again, you're talking about like those Tyler Warren, those guys that can work in line and then also maybe move around a little bit. You're looking at Luke Lachey. We know the history of Iowa tight ends. Another player you talk about NFL bloodlines. His dad, Jim, was a multiple-time All-Pro offensive tackle. So he's got a lot in his corner there. And for me, watching the tape, like I was concerned about the athleticism. And then we came into the combine and he tested and he hit it. So that moved him up my board because I thought the technical ability would be there, but it's again, you talk about it can be a death knell for these guys that if you're a sub 5.0 relative athletic score, just forget about it. It just doesn't really happen for tight ends. It seems to be this relative athletic score from Kentley Platt that we've got in our Football Guys rookie guide, and Ken has so graciously allowed us to use that, and he does a fantastic work there. Tight end feels like more than any other position. It just plays out to be true that players that are athletic, that score well, because this is a testing across the board in different athletic categories at tight end, tend to end up being those guys that are productive. So it's not a qualifier, it's a disqualifier, but Luke Lachey certainly made it through the gate of a qualifier there.
Now, the last guy I want to talk about in this tier is a guy that I got to be honest, Jeff, I wasn't extremely familiar with before Combine Week. You had talked about him a little bit. I hadn't even had a chance to fully scout him yet. But Joshua Simon out of South Carolina, I think, was one of the brightest stars from this week in Indy. The athletic testing was nice, but really it was more the drills. Watching him run the gauntlet and watching him catch balls. He is just such a fluid mover. He almost looks like a slot wide receiver in a 6'5" tight end's body. He's just got this really natural, instinctual movement. So, like I said, a guy that I wasn't really too familiar with, but dug into the tape, looked at the numbers, and there's a lot to like with a guy like Joshua Simon. And this is my biggest mover from pre and post combine. I have moved him all the way up to tight end 9. You're even higher than me at tight end 7. Talk to me about Joshua Simon a little bit.
I mean, he's not one of my biggest movers because when we were putting together
Right.
the rookie
You're already
guide,
there.
I saw it and I was like, wow, this is a guy that can do some things. And so we saw that athletic testing come out. It's kind of, to me, it's kind of like, Jatavian Sanders he's like what people think Jatavian Sanders is. Like Josh Simon is actually that. So it's a very athletic guy out of South Carolina. We talk about these move tight ends, these players that can handle a lot of volume, that can be key focal points of the receiving game. And that's where he profiles. And, our Football Guys, Matt Waldman, I saw him drop some of his great scouting. And I think maybe one concern is Joshua Simon's a little bit of a clapper with the ball. And so that can be a worrying case sometimes with guys that have, some guys present that target and they catch the ball softly, and other guys try to put their hands around the ball as the ball is coming. And that is one knock maybe that I have seen out of his potential profile. But at the same time, that athleticism was off the charts. You watch him at South Carolina making plays all over the field. And so that's what you want to see.
Yeah, hopefully they're able to coach that out of him because you don't want that rubbing off on his teammates either. I have heard that the clap is contagious. Let's move on to tier 4 here. And this is again, I think all these guys that we talked about, these first 8 tight ends, I think I don't want to oversell it, but I think all 8 of these guys that we've discussed so far could be fantasy relevant tight ends within a year or two. I mean, they're all very talented players, very athletic players that should go within the first 2 days of the NFL draft. Now we start getting into some of the other guys that are maybe the tweeners, too big to be a wide receiver, too small to be a tight end, maybe your more traditional tight ends that are good for football but not necessarily for fantasy football. So let's go through this tier right here, tier 4. Arande Gadsden, another guy with good bloodlines. His father was an NFL player, came out of Syracuse, very thin for his 6'5" frame. More of a wide receiver than a tight end. And, they were able to pepper him with some targets in Syracuse, but a lot of times we don't see this translate to the NFL. I know our Cecil Lammy in Indy asked Gadsden why he transferred from wide receiver to tight end. And he didn't really have the best answer. He was just like, my coaches recommended that I do it, so I did it. And that's why he's playing tight end now. How do you feel about Gadsden? Because I am a little bit higher on him than you are. So tell me what it is about Gadsden that might have you a little bit concerned.
Well, I think the reason why he moved positions early in his career, he was just kind of limited in his route tree, and it was a lot of vertical type stuff, a lot of like utilizing his size downfield, outside. It's kind of guy. Gosh, who was the guy from Florida State last year? Wilson, but went to the Eagles. I'm trying to think of the
Johnny
really
Wilson.
huge what? Yeah,
Yes.
the
Johnny
huge wide
Wilson, the wide
receiver.
receiver. Yeah. Yeah.
It was kind of that, but like not that level of athlete probably, but like a lot of just downfield type of things. And so I think that they looked at it, and especially having a dad that had NFL bloodlines, they kind of said, well, your path is going to be as a tight end if you make it into the NFL. So let's get you rolling on that, is kind of what I
Yeah.
think happened there. I don't know. Just kind of iffy, I think, probably. I
Yeah.
don't think he's the level of athlete that you would really want to see, maybe compared to some of these other guys, and he's not the rounded tight end that you want to see. I mean, some of it's Matt Harmon always makes a good point that somebody will watch the scouting report, and if there's one drop, that they will put drop on that scouting report, and then they like every single time they'll say drop. But then like I watched the smallest like bit of the tight end drills on Friday night, and Gadsden comes up, and every tight end's catching the ball, Gadsden just drops it. And it's just kind of like one of those things of like, okay,
Frustrating to see. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's just I think it's just iffy. I think in one of the things that it's this tier is interesting. We talked a little bit pre-show about the difference between these guys that are more natural wide receiver type tight ends that can be those fantasy guys versus more of those inline guys that they'll be on the field and maybe their upside is 45 to 50 balls, and you're kind of like, well, he's like tight end 18 best case. But those guys actually get on the field, and some of these
Yeah.
guys like Ron Gadsden don't really get on the field. And so it's kind of like one of the, like, what direction you want to go, pick your adventure here.
Yeah. Do you want the Mike Gesicki who is running routes and not doing much with them? Or do you want the Michael Mayer who's on the field all the time but not running the routes? And I feel like that's where we are with a lot of these guys right here. They're all probably getting drafted in this tier, but fantasy relevance could be an uphill battle for all of them. Now, this next guy I want to talk about out of Nebraska is another guy that you turned me on to, a guy that I wasn't too familiar with, Thomas Fidone, and he has had 2 ACL tears. So really rough go when it comes to injuries throughout his collegiate career. But a yards after the catch guy, I mean, he just plays with a tenacity that I really like. So a little bit clunky at times, and it's tough when you're looking at these guys. Is that just how he plays, or is that how he plays because he's coming off 2 ACLs and he can get better over time? But he's a guy that I've moved up a little bit after digging into him as well. You are going to be a little bit higher on Fidone than I am. You've got him as your tight end 9. I've got him as my tight end 12. But I think we both really like the player here. Anything you'd like to add on Thomas Fidone, Jeff?
He was number 1 in his recruiting class, tight end in the nation. Who do you think was number 2 in his recruiting class?
I'm going to go with Tyler Warren.
Brock Bowers was number 2.
Ooh.
We talk about number 1 in his recruiting class. The athleticism is there. The size is there. Prototypical size at the tight end position. He's going to be an inline tight end, but again, I mean, he puts everything together. This is a bet on athletic upside that didn't quite get there on college production because Nebraska a little bit iffy in their offensive situation, switching some coaches, switching some quarterbacks there. The injuries held him back as well. It's just a bet on if everything clicks. This is a player that has one of the highest upsides in the class.
So the next guy I want to talk about here is Jalin Conyers, a guy who played at Texas Tech, another high school quarterback turned tight end. And I think when I watch him, what I get most excited about is the usage that they used him on at Texas Tech. I mean, this guy was a wildcat quarterback. He played wide receiver out wide. He was out of the slot. They lined him up in the backfield. I mean, they were doing whatever they could to get the ball in his hands. And he checks all of those superficial boxes. You know, he's big, he's strong, he's fast, but he has a very clear lack of production in college. And despite Texas Tech repeatedly trying to get the ball in his hands, the production just wasn't really there. And that raises some concerns for me. Again, like I said, he checks all the superficial boxes, but I just can't get over the lack of production in high school. So, Jeff, when it comes to Jalin Conyers, looks like you and I are very similar here. I've got him at tight end 13. You've got him as tight end 11. Is there anything I'm missing in his game? I've got my player count for Jalin Conyers as Albert Okwuegbunam.
He's I think he might have ate Albert Okwuegbunam, to be honest with you. I mean, he came in as a wide receiver / defensive back. He was a high level recruit, tight end 4 in his class, started out of Oklahoma, bounced around a little bit. So he came in at 6'4", 220, and now he's 6'5", 270. So that kind of tells you a little bit of he actually does bring the size to the position to be able to play in line. I would like him quite a bit because he does have that size, because we've seen, you mentioned the wildcat usage, the creative ability to get the ball in his hands. Maybe if the tush push goes away, some of these tight ends that have played in those types of roles might kind of fall into some interesting value.
Mark Andrews and Tucker Kraft are already doing it. All right, Jeff, the next guy we're going to talk about, Gunnar Helm, as we talked about at the top of the show. You know, athleticism is very closely tied to career production. And what we saw from Gunnar Helm was just a terrible combine performance. And I faded him all the way down to tight end 17, you know, basically saying that this guy might go undrafted because of how bad his combine performance was. But wait, we find out the morning after that he actually sprained his ankle running the 40. And sure enough, I mean, his ankle ballooned up. It was black and blue. So let's not really talk about Gunnar Helm too much where we have him ranked, because I think for now we both kind of have him as a placeholder until we see his pro day. But let me just ask you a simple question, Jeff. Do you think that he gained or lost points from NFL teams for playing through that injury? Because the athletic testing was bad, but, you know, he's a guy. He rubbed some dirt on it and just went out there and still performed.
It's fascinating. It's definitely a fascinating conversation, because you're looking at all this testing and down to the 10th of a second or whatever it might be, everything is scrutinized and judged. And I think it is a plus that he toughed it out. It's a plus for his overall profile that maybe there was a legitimate reason. It puts a tremendous amount of pressure, I think, on his pro day of he has to perform. If he is healthy at that point and able to go at that point, it has to show up, because if it doesn't, then he's already got all of these down in the books and in the ledger. And so that's where, you know, he had disappointing testing. He had a disappointing day, disappointing combine. He gets a reset. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway probably from it. And maybe some brownie points with that toughness, but it is a reset for him moving forward.
And I just checked. Texas's pro day is March 18th. That gives him less than 3 weeks to recover from what was a pretty severe ankle sprain. I mean, I'm sure you saw the pictures that Ian Rappaport tweeted. I mean, his ankle ballooned up, was bruising like crazy. 3 weeks is not time to necessarily get to 100%. So he might have to forego his pro day, or maybe we see some bad testing times there as well if he's still recovering. So Gunnar Helm is going to be a really interesting story, but the college production was there. I mean, he looked very good at Texas. He was one of the primary weapons for Quinn Ewers there, but we'll see what he's able to do at his pro day. 2 more guys left in this tier, and these 2 guys could not be more different. First guy we'll talk about is CJ Dippre. When I watch him, I think he's a guy who is a very, very good NFL tight end. I mean, will be a good NFL tight end, I should say. Played in Alabama, so he's familiar with the pro-style offense, and he is a big dude, 6'5", 260, really, really thick frame. But there wasn't a lot of production there. I think that he is more of your traditional hand in the dirt, getting dirty, blocking, and I think that's going to get him drafted. Could get him on the field, but I don't know how much fantasy production you'll see here outside of the occasional touchdown. Do you have any strong thoughts on CJ Dippre, Jeff?
I was thrilled with the athletic testing. He was a player that was higher in my ranks than probably consensus ranks. You flash back to him at Maryland. He was an instant impact player at Maryland. Then he hit the transfer portal, and it was really kind of a recruiting battle between Alabama and Ohio State. And he ultimately chose Alabama. And you talk about production, it's either direction that he goes, Alabama or Ohio State. They
Yeah.
just don't use the tight end at all much in those offenses. And I think that that's something that you see at the high end schools, because tight ends can be so iffy year to year on the impact that they're able to create, that what you'll see a lot of these college offenses don't prioritize the position at an Alabama or Ohio State, because it's much easier to get the next blue chip wide receiver. And you kind of know what you're getting with the wide
Mhm.
receiver versus a tight end being such a difficult position to be able to learn to block and also be a primary receiver, those types of things. And so you're just not going to see a lot of production usually from high end schools out of the tight end position, outside of like maybe your Penn States or your Michigans that do love that position more than most. And so that kind of is the reason why there. But again, he's more of that inline player, more of that blocker. I do think that, well, it's not even sneaky athletic anymore. We've got the testing. He is an athletic player that can be a presence in the red zone.
Last guy we'll talk about in this tier is Jake Briningstool. Briningstool, a guy out of Clemson who became the number 2 target on his team this year. When I watch him, he is a very tall, very thin guy. I didn't see exactly what he came in at the combine. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but last I saw Jeff, he was listed at 6'6", 240. And I'd be surprised if he's 240 pounds. Like I said, he is a thin guy, and he plays like he's got a smaller frame. There's a lot of strength after the catch. The twitchiness isn't really there. I mean, he can build up long speed if he gets, some green ahead of him, but Stool. I keep saying Stool is another one of those guys that I think is just kind of too big to be a wide receiver, too small to be a tight end. And sometimes these guys who are productive in college do concern me a little bit, because we rarely see these kind of college tweeners pan out in the NFL. Is that kind of how you feel about Briningstool? I'm 0 for 3 on that one. Is that kind of how you feel about Briningstool, Jeff?
It is, and I think that when you're looking that kind of hybrid player, you want to defer maybe more towards the guy that can, well, you definitely want to defer more towards the guy that can make an impact in the quick passing game, and that
Yeah,
can be that underneath player,
that
the
is not
ability to create
Briningstool.
after the catch. Yeah, kind of these guys that I feel like definitely don't really work out very often are these kind of oversized wide receiver, like big outside type wide receivers and
Hmm.
power slot type players that they're also tight ends, and you're just not knowing what you're getting on either of those guys. You want, again, the Jonnu Smith that can be a fullback and an inline player and a flex player, and he can create after the catch. Like that's kind of the tweener profile that you're looking for, not kind of these guys that, I guess maybe it is the Mike Gesicki type profile, but I don't think
Yeah.
he's the level of athlete of a Mike Gesicki. And again, Mike Gesicki has driven all of us mad with his inconsistent stretches of performance.
Yeah, so if that's the ceiling outcome for a guy like Stool, can't get too excited about a guy with that sort of profile. Now let's just kind of lump all these guys together here in tier 5, Jeff, because we got a bunch of guys here. I'm going to go through and rattle off all of the names. This would be our tight end 15 through tight end 20. And I just want you to talk to me about one guy that you think has an opportunity to really separate himself from the pack and find himself in a relevant role out of this tier. So we've got Mitchell Evans, Molokai Matavao, Caden Preekscorn, G. Scott Jr., Bryson Nesbitt, and Gavin Bartholomew. I'm sure I got all of those names right. And if I didn't, please let me know in the YouTube comments. But Jeff, of those 5 guys that we have in tier 5, 6 guys in tier 5, I should say, who do you think is the most likely to separate themselves from the pack?
Maleki Matavado is the one that I really like. He was a high end recruit. He was in the same recruiting class to Oregon as Terrence Ferguson. Ferguson just kind of pulled ahead from him a little bit, and then he ended up landing in UCLA. They obviously Chip Kelly was the head coach 2 years ago at UCLA, and then they brought Deshaun Foster in as the head coach this past year and kind of overhauled the offense. And he emerged as the primary receiver within that offense, but he's another player that he brings the requisite size that you want from the position at an inline player. He was a standout during the Senior Bowl. Athletic testing, I was hoping would be a little bit better. He did a decent job there, but he didn't blow it out of the water by any means. But I think that when you're looking at the size, the play in the position. He does have that. He has soft hands. We've seen some receiving production there, blue chip background, so all those types of things.
That's exactly what I was going to say as well. We talked about it multiple times on today's show that athleticism for tight ends really translates well to the NFL level. And this guy, I mean, he is a monster. Came in just a hair under 6'6" and 260 pounds, second fast 40 time of the entire tight end group this weekend. So when you see a guy with that rare combo of size, strength, and speed, that's definitely a guy worth taking a flyer on. We'll see where he gets drafted, but right now, my Jeff, I haven't done any 5-round rookie drafts, but I assume that's probably where he's going to be falling in your rookie drafts. So you can probably get him with a 5th-round pick, right?
Yeah, I think, or undrafted in a lot of those.
Yeah, so a guy to keep an eye on and a guy who could absolutely be a riser as we get a little bit closer to the NFL draft. Speaking of which, we did an episode on Monday, if you want to check that out, on NFL risers and fallers, where we talk about some of the guys who made the best and worst impressions last week in Indianapolis. So be sure to check that out and subscribe to the YouTube channel and check out all of the videos that Jeff and I are going to have coming your way between now and the NFL draft. I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
I want to say too, shout out. We did a tight end show. Shout out to our guy, Andrew Cooper, winning Writer of the Year and Article of the Year, the tight end whisperer, our good friend. Shout out Fantasy Alarm, Andrew Cooper. Congratulations, buddy.
Yes, absolutely, Andrew. Way to go. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.